We've been taught to look at the domes and spires of old cities as pure beauty, pure faith. Since childhood we were told they built these shapes for prayer, rituals, symbols. But the moment you step away from that familiar picture and look at these forms, like someone who notices details, the feeling changes. Metal finials, strange crowns, complex lattices, sharp needles aimed at the sky. It starts to look less like decoration and more like a device. And if that thought hooks you even once, it becomes hard to unsee what's right in front of us. Why does almost every major old city have a needle pointing upward? Why is there so much metal up there, where stone would have been enough? Why do buildings from completely different countries repeat the same elements, as if they were built from the same blueprint? And most of all, why are we pushed so hard not to ask these questions? Welcome to a channel where we look at history without extra polish and without the habit of believing on command. If you also feel that official explanations sometimes don't add up, support the video with a like, subscribe, and write in the comments what you've noticed yourself. Personal observations, family stories, old photos, local facts, everything helps. Alone, a piece looks random. Together, the picture starts to appear. Let's start with the obvious, the thing everyone sees but almost nobody studies closely. The tops of many old buildings look like they were built to work, not just to impress. On some spires, you can see metal details that resemble antennas. Some designs have multiple layers, like it's not simply a cross or a crescent, but a complicated node. And the strangest part is how often similar shapes appear in places that have nothing to do with each other, as if, at some point, they belonged to one system. The official explanation is simple. It was style. It was fashionable. That's how it was done. But then another question appears. Why does this style look like an engineering language? Why does it repeat not like art, but like a standard component, something you install again and again? And why are these components placed exactly where height and open sky matter most? There is a theory people usually mention with a smirk or only in whispers. The idea that old temples, cathedrals, and large classical buildings could have been part of a network, a system that collected and transmitted energy through the air. Free energy from the environment sounds like fantasy today, but too many architectural forms fit that idea suspiciously well. If you imagine these spires as receivers or nodes, then it becomes clearer why they were built in huge numbers and why they look so similar. And here, the first big paradox shows up. We're told many of these structures were created in an era when people supposedly had no powerful tools, no precise machinery, no large resources. Yet the quality of stonework, the precision of fitting, and the sheer scale often look like the result of developed production, not a handmade world struggling to survive. So where did the money come from for thousands of objects like this? Where did the manpower come from? And why does the world described in textbooks, poor, heavy, almost primitive, leave behind architecture that looks expensive, complex, and strangely standardized? Now there is another point many people feel but rarely say out loud. Inside old buildings, there is often a subtle sensation that everything wasn't designed for us. Doorways can be too tall. Staircases can be too wide, with steps unusually high. Railings on balconies sometimes sit at a height that feels almost at an adult's neck. You can call it grandeur. You can say they wanted to show status. But in everyday life, builders don't do inconvenience as a lifestyle, just for beauty. A real craftsman builds around the person who will use it. If opening a door or reaching a window is uncomfortable, people change it. because living like that every day is unbearable. So when similar inconveniences repeat across countries, another thought appears. What if these spaces weren't designed for our height and not for our habits? What if we arrived later and simply occupied ready-made spaces? That's where the most triggering idea comes from. Maybe in the past, there were people of a different scale, taller, stronger, more resilient. Then huge doors, high halls, and strange proportions stop being a mystery. They become normal for the ones who designed them. But if you allow that possibility for even a minute, one question becomes unavoidable. Where did the builders go? Why did the cities remain, but the owners vanished? Why did we inherit streets and walls, but not clear explanations that survive basic everyday logic? And this is not just a story for the sake of a story, because the deeper you go, the more strange coincidences start to appear. Old footage with empty streets, odd population imbalances, a feeling that adults are missing, and the world is being filled again. In late 19th and early 20th century photos and descriptions, one detail keeps showing up: too many children and teenagers, and too few adults. It doesn't look like hard times alone. It looks like the aftermath of something big, something after which the world had to be assembled again. Official history loves simple answers. Poverty, a harsh century, that's just how it was. But poverty doesn't explain why whole blocks look like stage sets with almost no people. Poverty doesn't explain why cities stand there, but life inside them feels delayed. And poverty doesn't explain why the architecture around them looks too complicated and too expensive for the world we're told was half manual and barely developed. The most uncomfortable part of this topic is that it forces you to look at the familiar differently. Because if we really live among traces of someone else's larger system, then a lot of what feels normal might simply be the habit of not asking. And then any detail, a dome, a spire, a strange doorway height, stops being architecture and becomes evidence. One clue is an accident. Two is a coincidence. But when the same strangeness repeats all over the world, it starts to look like a system. There is one historical signal that becomes hard to unsee once you notice it. In chronicles from the end of the 19th century and the start of the 20th, children appear too often in places where, logically, adults should be. Children in factories, children in the streets, children in the fields, as if entire cities were held together by teenagers, not by grown men and women. Officially, this is explained bluntly: poverty and cruelty. But the scale forces a more precise question. If this is just poverty, why does it look like a systemic shortage of adults? That period mentions overcrowded orphanages and phenomena like orphan trains, moving large groups of children in bulk just to relocate and place them. This doesn't feel like normal hardship in one country or one region. It feels like a situation where there are too many children and far fewer adults than a normal society should have. In a traditional world, adults carry the hardest work, and children are protected as much as possible. So the normalization of child labor on an industrial scale looks less like a character of the era and more like a sign that the system failed. If you lay it out as simple observations, it becomes a chain. First, photos and sources show large numbers of children without obvious family support nearby. Second, child labor is described as ordinary, not exceptional. Third, there were mechanisms to redistribute children en masse, because in some places there were simply too many. And here, a version appears that people hate to say directly. After some major event, The world had to be populated again, and children became the material for a new society. Not in a mystical sense, in a practical one. Children adapt faster. They accept new rules. They learn the new normal. They live without memory of what was before. Now the second block of evidence, one you can test with your own feet, without archives or experts. In many old cities, the first floors of buildings look like they were pressed into the ground. This isn't a basement in the usual sense. It's a floor with windows, sometimes with beautiful frames, sometimes with decoration that makes no sense for a technical level. These windows often sit half below the sidewalk, like openings staring into asphalt. And most importantly, you see this not in one city and not in one country. It repeats across continents. Official science gives a calming explanation. Cultural layer. Over centuries, the street rises. Trash, repairs, new road surfaces, and the ground becomes higher. It sounds reasonable until you test it with everyday logic. If a house has windows on the first floor, the owner will not calmly watch the street level rise until it blocks daylight. They'll raise entrances, rebuild drainage, change stairs, because otherwise that floor turns into a damp, dark box. And roads are usually repaired differently too. Old pavement is removed and replaced. Cities don't normally stack layers forever until an entire floor is buried. Here is what restoration people and excavations near old foundations often show. Once they remove the soil, the basement can look like a full floor. High openings, arches, decorative elements, sometimes even traces of former entrances. Who designs basements like ceremonial rooms? It doesn't look like the original plan. And then there is the nature of the soil itself. Many descriptions emphasize that this is often not a loose layer of household debris. It is dense, uniform clay or loam with almost no organic material. That kind of ground looks more like deposited sediment after a large movement of earth or water than slow accumulation from daily life. So an alternative hypothesis appears. In the past, there was a large cataclysm that brought massive volumes of clay and suddenly raised the surface level by meters. People call it different names, but the core idea is the same. Not we slowly built it up, but it covered us. Now the survival logic turns on again. If part of a city was buried, the survivors or new residents wouldn't have the resources to excavate everything. It would be easier to level the surface, turn former second floors into new first floors, and use what's below as storage, or forget it entirely. This explains why old buildings so often have strange staircases down into rooms that look too rich to be basements. It also explains why some underground spaces feel like they belonged to everyday life, not technical service. If you want to check this without fighting on the internet, there is a simple local test. Find an old building in a historic center and look at where the window line begins, above the sidewalk or below it. Look at the basement windows. Are they tiny vents, or are they normal-sized windows that ended up in the ground? Look at courtyard doors in old blocks. Sometimes you'll see entrances that go down, as if they once opened to a lower street level. Now notice what happens when you put these two blocks together, the child anomaly and the buried floors. They start to rhyme in a disturbing way. In one case, it looks like society was rebuilt using children with a shortage of adults. In the other, it looks like cities were rebuilt after a sudden change in ground level, turning normal spaces into underground levels. That's not a proof in one sentence, but it's two observations that both fit badly inside a smooth, simple, official picture. And then a third question appears, practical and unavoidable. If part of the old world is muted under soil and new layers, How many more traces are still around us? Not in archives, on real streets under our feet, because buried floors are only the beginning. Next come objects that are even harder to explain away with "that's just how it turned out," because their meaning reads best from above. Star forts. These are fortifications shaped like perfect stars, with symmetric points, matching walls, moats, and geometry that looks almost too clean for the scale. The strangest part is that they appear not in one country, but across Europe, Asia, North America, Australia, and Africa, and they share the same handwriting. The official explanation is familiar: bastion fortifications designed for artillery, built by different states in different eras. But in that explanation, a weak point appears immediately. How did they achieve such precision on something that stretches hundreds of meters? And why is the form so correct, as if it was drawn on paper and then stamped onto the landscape? To lay out that symmetry, you need accurate measurements, clean angles, and control over leveling across large distances. That's hard to do without good mapping and strong surveying methods. And there is another detail many people miss. These forts are often surrounded by water and canals, and it's done with a precision that makes water feel like part of the design, not just an obstacle. If it's only defense, water is just to make it harder. But then why does the same scheme repeat again and again, as if it's a standard infrastructure node? Once you see that kind of standardization, you start noticing it elsewhere. Across different cities and countries, in Europe, America, the Russian Empire, port and trade centers, you find civic buildings that look like they were built from the same architectural logic. Stations, theaters, museums, administrative buildings. They share the same columns, porticos, domes, arches, and sometimes it feels less like inspiration and more like a repeatable template. We're told it's fashion, influence, tradition, but the scale and the same solutions in very different climates looks suspiciously unified. Now comes the loudest episode, usually sold as a celebration of progress: the World's Fairs of the late 19th and early 20th century. Official history claims that in different cities, in unbelievably short time frames, a year or two, entire exhibition complexes were built that looked like luxurious palace cities. Massive facades, towers, colonnades, canals, whole cities in an antique style. And then comes the part that breaks common sense. We are told that much of this was temporary, built of wood, plaster, mixtures that imitated stone. And after the fair, it was simply demolished. But why would anyone pour enormous resources into building something so massive for a few months, only to turn it into dust by choice? Even if you accept some temporary pavilions, the scale remains the problem. Too much, too complex for build it and forget it. There is a version that sounds more logical, even though it's uncomfortable. Many exhibition complexes may not have been built from scratch. They may have been ready-made spaces that were cleaned, repaired, restored, and presented to the public as the achievement of the age. And whatever didn't fit the new story could be labeled temporary and removed without questions. And then another repeating motif appears: major fires, large complexes and pavilions often burned, and fire solves several problems at once. Blueprints vanish, materials disappear, details are destroyed, and all that remains is ash. And you can't argue what the thing really was, because the evidence is gone. After a fire, the sentence, "it was temporary anyway," becomes almost impossible to challenge. But there are things even fire can't hide completely: the logic of the architecture. In northern cities, you find old buildings with enormous windows, sometimes close to the floor, which in a cold climate is strange because of heat loss. You often see entrances without proper thermal buffers, no vestibules, no double-door zones, the things people normally build in cold regions, so winter air doesn't hit the main hall directly. Add high ceilings of several meters, and heating those volumes with traditional methods becomes extremely difficult because warm air rises and disappears above you. And here comes the unpleasant question. If these buildings were designed for harsh winters, you would expect integrated heating logic, big chimneys, planned stoves, built-in buffers. Yet in many cases, fireplaces and stoves look like later additions. They can break symmetry, look cut into a finished interior. Chimneys and pipes sometimes look like forced retrofits, not original parts of an ideal plan. Put all of this side by side, and you don't get one oddity. You get a repeating set of signals, perfect star forts like standardized geometry, a unified antique language across civic architecture in different countries. World's fairs presented as temporary, despite looking too monumental. Fires that conveniently erase proof. Buildings in cold climates that feel like they were designed for different assumptions, and later adapted with retrofitted heating. The important part isn't who is right. The important part is that questions multiply when you compare details together instead of isolating each one. That's why collecting observations matters. Where is a star fort located? How is it laid out? How does water relate to it? What do old city plans show? What do entrances and window lines show? How do basements look? And where is the old ground level? Open any old photograph from the late 19th or early 20th century showing a main street of a major city and try looking not at faces but at scale. Often the first feeling is strange. Buildings look like they were built with a surplus, as if designed for a different level of life. Columns, arches, embankments, the width of avenues, everything feels too monumental compared to the daily reality of the people captured in the frame. On these photos, you can feel a mismatch. Small figures, carts, simple street markets, standing next to massive facades, like life hasn't caught up to the set. It feels like the city was calculated for a different transport, a different flow, a different density, and a different power of society. And that feeling isn't local. It repeats when you look at architecture across countries that somehow speaks the same language of form. Officially, this is called progress. People developed, became richer, became smarter, built better and better. But when better looks like it arrived earlier, the logic breaks. It starts to feel less like growth from bottom to top, and more like a situation where someone moved into something already built and started living inside it the best they could. There is a version that sounds harsh, but it explains too much. We are not the builders of this world. We are the tenants, like people who walked into empty houses and made them livable without fully understanding what they were originally designed for. In everyday life, this is called squatting, occupying a ready-made space because you have no other option. Scale that up to cities and you get an uncomfortable question. What if we really live in an inheritance, not in a result? Then many mysteries stop being separate. They become traces of adaptation. First floors sink into the ground and former second floors become new first floors. Giant halls, high ceilings, uncomfortable cold climate entrances start getting cut down. Windows are bricked, partitions are added, volumes are reduced, because otherwise you can't live there. Stoves and fireplaces appear as later inserts, even if they ruin symmetry. Chimneys go where they can, not where they should, because the plan is already there and you're just trying to survive inside it. That is not mystical. That is normal human logic. If someone ends up in a huge cold space without proper protection from wind and frost, they won't talk about beauty. They'll block windows and build any heating that works, even if it looks ugly. So the strange architecture in cold cities, huge windows, lack of vestibules, doors straight into halls, starts to feel like a trace of another era, another set of conditions, another energy assumption. And here a word appears that many people dislike because it sounds too dramatic. Reset. Not a magical reset, a meaningful one. As if there was a period when the previous system disappeared and new life began on ready-made platforms without full memory of what came before. That would explain why so many historic frames feel like people are out of place on the background of giant architecture, and why for a long time society looks like it was simply learning how to use what already existed. If this scenario is even partially true, then one more thing becomes clearer: why the past is full of explanations instead of answers. When someone inherits complex infrastructure but doesn't have the knowledge, they invent stories to calm themselves. They call the unknown decoration, symbol, tradition, fashion, because it's easier that way. Then education systems arrive, and the story becomes official, because it is short, convenient, and doesn't invite extra questions. You can see this logic whenever history shuts down a topic too quickly. When they say huge exhibition cities were temporary, and then they burned or were demolished. The word temporary removes the need to explain where that power of construction came from. Fire turns everything into ash, and there is nothing left to argue with. And now, the main point. If we didn't build this world from scratch, then who decided we should be the main heroes of the story? Who decided we must think of ourselves as the peak of development, not as people picking up fragments after a major loss? Why do we so rarely ask who benefited when we see the same solutions repeated globally? From perfect geometric forts to unified civic styles. From this angle, even ordinary city details change their meaning. Wide boulevards and embankments look like logistics designed for a different scale. Domes and spires look like elements of a system that was later explained as religion and tradition. Buried floors look like the aftermath of an event, after which it was easier to raise life upward than to restore the old level. And here is the question that freezes people when they face it honestly. If these are traces of an older order, why is our memory of it so broken? Why do we have stone, metal, geometry, and scale, but so few clear explanations that survive basic, everyday questions? And why are attempts to connect these observations into one picture so often met with laughter instead of calm checking? There is a simple test for official history. If an explanation is true, it survives everyday questions. Why was this needed? Who benefited? Why is it the same in different places? How was it done without the tools the timeline claims? But when an explanation gets angry at questions and demands blind belief, something is being hidden. That's why we won't argue with slogans. We will build the picture from signals you can see on the ground, on facades, and in old photos. First signal: repetition of forms. When the same solutions appear across countries, it looks less like fashion and more like a standard. Star forts with perfect geometry, repeated layouts, water involvement. It feels like a standard node, not a whim of separate rulers. Add the unified antique language of civic buildings, columns, domes, porticos, arches, and the picture becomes harder, as if a shared engineering approach once operated globally. Second signal: traces of a sudden change in life level. full floors that end up below the sidewalk, windows staring into asphalt, basements that look like normal rooms. This feels like the aftermath of something after which it was easier to lift the city upward than to return to the old surface. And it repeats too widely to feel local. Third signal: climate and comfort anomalies. In northern latitudes, you see huge windows, entrances without proper thermal buffers, halls so tall they are hard to heat with traditional methods. And you see signs that stoves, fireplaces, chimneys may have been added later as emergency adaptations. This forces an unpleasant thought. Either conditions were different, or the original design assumed a different source of energy and capability. Fourth signal: show it and burn it. The World's Fair's story often sounds like a paradox. Giant palace-like complexes appear quickly, are called temporary, and then vanish by demolition or fire. Temporary removes the need to explain origins. Fire removes evidence. When this pattern repeats, it starts to feel less like random misfortune and more like a useful method. Now put this into one short, hard hypothesis. No mysticism, no beautiful words. Maybe the planet once had a more unified infrastructure, standard forts, standard civic templates, standard roof elements that later became symbols. Then an event happened that buried parts of cities. Climate and conditions shifted. New populations didn't build from zero. They adapted, not because they were stupid, but because survival came first. Understanding came later, and often never came. And suddenly, many things fall into place. Why facades look like they were built for centuries, while old chronicles show long periods of small, poor daily life. Why architecture often feels not designed for our comfort or our climate, and has to be modified. Why people in old photos look out of place against massive decorations. Why it is easier to call it fashion than to admit we may be living inside something we didn't create. The most uncomfortable question in this whole story is not about forts or fairs. It is this: if we are only living inside someone else's inheritance, who and why erased the memory of the builders? Why were we left with stone and metal, but not a clear narrative that survives basic checks? And why is the instinctive reaction to these questions laughter instead of investigation? You don't have to believe, you have to check. Walk your city, look at basement windows, compare old photographs, study star fort maps, pay attention to repeating roof details and ground-level anomalies. And if this kind of analysis is for you, like the video and subscribe. Most importantly, write in the comments what you've seen personally. Buried floors, strange doors and windows, nearby star forts, unusual spires, and metal finials. Let's gather the pattern together. The more observations and real points we connect, the closer we get to an answer.